The Appalachian Mountains stood silent as Sarah pushed through the cabin door, rain-soaked and desperate. The old hunting lodge had been abandoned for decades, but it offered shelter from the storm that had been chasing her for 3 days. She just needed somewhere safe to sleep. But safety was the last thing she'd find here. The main room looked normal enough. Dusty furniture, cobwebs, the smell of decay. Then she noticed the basement door, slightly ajar. Against every instinct screaming at her to leave, Sarah descended those creaking wooden steps. What she discovered changed everything she thought she knew about her past. Dozens of missing person flyers covered the walls, newspaper clippings about unsolved disappearances. And there, pinned to the center of it all, was a photo she hadn't seen in 20 years, herself as a 7-year-old girl the day before her sister vanished. Sarah wasn't just any homeless woman seeking shelter. She was Detective Sarah Chen, forced into hiding after getting too close to a case that powerful people wanted buried. But why was her childhood photo in a killer's trophy room? Her hands trembled as she stepped closer to the makeshift shrine. The photo was exactly as she remembered, herself in pigtails and a bright yellow sundress, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while her older sister Emma stood behind her, protective arms wrapped around Sarah's shoulders, their last happy moment together. Sarah's breathing became shallow as she scanned the surrounding materials. Newspaper headlines screamed from yellowed clippings, local girl vanishes without trace, search called off after 2 weeks, family devastated by daughter's disappearance. Each article felt like a knife twisting in her chest. But it was the handwritten notes, scattered among the clippings, that made her blood run cold. Meticulous observations in cramped handwriting detailed Emma's daily routines, her favorite places, her friends. The notes read like a predator's hunting manual, complete with timestamps and behavioral patterns. Sarah forced herself to examine the other missing person flyers. Girls between 8 and 16, all with dark hair and slight builds, all bearing an unsettling resemblance to Emma. The dates spanned decades, starting from the early 1980s and continuing through just last year. Dozens of faces stared back at her, someone's daughters, sisters, friends, all united by their disappearance and their similarity to Emma. Inside were meticulously organized files, each labeled with a name and date. Her fingers found Emma's file with horrible inevitability. The folder was thick, filled with photographs taken from a distance, Emma walking to school, playing in their backyard, sitting on the front porch reading. The voyeuristic invasion made Sarah's stomach churn. Beneath the photos lay a detailed timeline of Emma's final weeks. Someone had documented her every move with obsessive precision. The last entry was dated the night Emma disappeared. Subject left house through bedroom window at 11:47 p.m., heading toward Creek Path as predicted. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank into the dusty chair beside the filing cabinet. For 20 years, she'd believed Emma had run away because of their parents' messy divorce. The family had fractured completely after Emma's disappearance, their mother retreating into alcoholism and depression, their father moving across the country to start over. Sarah had spent her childhood blaming herself, wondering if she'd driven Emma away with her neediness or demanding behavior. But Emma hadn't run away. She'd been hunted. A sound from upstairs made Sarah freeze. The front door creaked open, followed by heavy footsteps across the wooden floor. Someone was here. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Had she been followed? Was this a coincidence, or had she walked into a trap? She silently cursed herself for getting sloppy. 3 days of running had exhausted her usual paranoia. The footsteps moved purposefully through the cabin, suggesting familiarity with the layout. This wasn't a random intruder or another desperate person seeking shelter. Someone knew this place intimately. Sarah quickly scanned the basement for alternate exits. A small window near the ceiling offered possible escape, but she'd have to climb over the filing cabinet to reach it. The basement stairs remained her only viable option, but they led directly toward whoever was now walking around upstairs. She could hear them moving through what sounded like a routine inspection, checking rooms, opening closets, testing locks. The methodical nature of the search suggested someone ensuring their hideout remained secure. 20 years of wondering, 20 years of guilt and unanswered questions, and now Sarah was potentially face to face with Emma's killer. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent the last 3 days running from one predator, only to stumble into the lair of another. The footsteps stopped directly above her. Then, slowly, they began moving toward the basement door. Sarah had seconds to decide, confront her past or continue running from it. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at her 8-year-old face smiling back at her. The image was yellowed at the edges, clearly torn from a larger photo, the same family portrait that had sat on their mantelpiece before that terrible night. She could see the edge of her mother's blue dress in the corner, a fragment of her father's hand on her shoulder. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts as the implications crashed over her like ice water. This wasn't some random vacation rental. This was his place. The monster who had taken everything from her lived here, walked these floors, sat in that worn leather chair she'd noticed in the living room. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees on the dusty floor, still clutching the photograph. 20 years of therapy, of sleepless nights, of jumping at shadows, and she'd walked straight into his lair. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. She forced herself to look at the other files scattered around her feet. Missing person flyers, newspaper clippings, more photographs. A blonde teenager from Portland, a young mother from Salem, a college student from Eugene. The dates spanned decades, some going back to the 1980s, others as recent as last year. Her family hadn't been his first victims, and they certainly hadn't been his last. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway froze her blood. Sarah's head snapped toward the small window near the ceiling. Through the dirty glass, she could see headlights cutting through the growing dusk. A vehicle was approaching the cabin. Panic seized her throat. She scrambled to her feet, shoving the photograph into her jacket pocket. Her hands shook as she tried to gather the scattered files, but there were too many, and the footsteps were already on the porch above. The front door opened with the familiar squeak she'd heard when she'd arrived hours earlier. Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the hidden door, her heart hammering so loud she was certain it would give her away. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor above, slow and deliberate. Cabinet doors opened and closed. Water ran in the kitchen sink. He was making himself at home. She had to get out. The narrow window was too small and too high, and even if she could reach it, the glass looked painted shut. The only exit was back through the basement and up those stairs, stairs that led directly to where he was moving around. More footsteps overhead, heading toward what she remembered was the bedroom. This might be her only chance. Sarah eased the hidden door open just enough to slip through, leaving the files scattered behind her. She crept across the basement floor, testing each step to avoid the creaking board she'd noticed earlier. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused, listening. Silence from above. She climbed the stairs one agonizing step at a time, her hand gripping the railing to distribute her weight. The basement door was still ajar, just as she'd left it. Through the gap she could see the kitchen was empty, but a lamp was now on in the living room. Sarah squeezed through the doorway and closed the basement door behind her, with barely a whisper of sound. Her rental car keys were on the kitchen counter where she'd left them, her overnight bag still sitting by the front door. The shower turned on in the bathroom. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her keys and bag and slipped out the front door. She didn't dare start the engine immediately. The sound would carry in the still mountain air. Instead, she put the car in neutral and let it roll down the slight incline of the driveway until she was far enough away, then started the engine and drove. She made it 3 miles down the winding mountain road before she had to pull over. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. She fumbled for her phone, then stopped. Call the police and tell them what? That she'd broken into someone's cabin and found old files? The photograph of herself was circumstantial at best, and she'd been trespassing. They'd want to know why she'd rented the cabin in the first place, and she couldn't explain the compulsion that had driven her here without sounding unstable. But those files, all those missing people, If even half of them were his victims, he was one of the most prolific serial killers in Pacific Northwest history, and he was still active. Sarah pulled out the photograph and studied it again in the dim light from her phone. Her younger self smiled up at her, innocent and trusting, unaware that in just a few hours her world would be destroyed. She thought of Detective Morrison, the only cop who'd believed her story 20 years ago, who'd promised they'd catch the man who killed her family. He was retired now, but maybe... Sarah started the engine again. She wasn't running anymore. She was going to finish this. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as memories crashed over her like a violent tide. 8 years old, gap-toothed smile, wearing the yellow sundress her mother had bought for the county fair. The same dress she'd been wearing the day her little brother Tommy disappeared from their backyard while she was supposed to be watching him. She forced herself to look at the other files scattered across the dusty table. Manila folders thick with newspaper clippings, photographs and handwritten notes in cramped, meticulous script. Each folder bore a name written in block letters across the tab. Jennifer Hayes, Michael Connor, Tommy Chen. Tommy Chen. Her brother's folder was easily the thickest. Sarah's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the edge of the table, her breathing shallow and rapid. 20 years of wondering, of guilt, of her family falling apart in the aftermath of Tommy's disappearance. And here was proof that someone had been watching them, studying them, planning. With trembling fingers, she opened Tommy's file. The first page was a detailed map of their old neighborhood, with their house circled in red ink. Times were noted in the margins. 7:30 a.m., father leaves for work. 8:15 a.m., mother departs, grocery store Tuesdays. There were dozens of entries documenting her family's daily routines with the precision of a military operation. A loose photograph slipped from the folder and fluttered to the floor. Sarah bent to retrieve it and felt bile rise in her throat. It was Tommy, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, playing on their old swing set, written on the back in that same careful handwriting. Perfect. The sound of a car engine in the distance made Sarah's blood freeze. She strained to listen, but the mountain wind carried the sound away. Was she imagining things? Her paranoia had been her constant companion for 2 decades, but now it might be the only thing keeping her alive. She quickly rifled through more folders, her horror mounting with each revelation. Crime scene photos, police reports that had never been made public, personal items that must have belonged to the victims, a child's bracelet, a class ring, a driver's license. This wasn't just evidence of surveillance, this was a trophy collection. At the bottom of the stack, she found a folder that made her heart stop entirely. Her own name was written across the tab in fresh ink, the letters darker than the others. Inside was a recent photograph of her apartment building in Denver, along with printouts from her social media accounts and copies of her credit card statements from the past 6 months. He'd been watching her, tracking her, and she'd walked right into his trap. The car engine sound returned, closer now and definitely real. Sarah's survival instincts finally overpowered her shock. She grabbed Tommy's file and her own, stuffing them inside her jacket. The evidence in this room could finally give her family the answers they'd never found, but only if she lived long enough to share it. She moved to the window and peered through a gap in the heavy curtains. Headlights were winding up the mountain road, still perhaps 10 minutes away, but approaching steadily. The driver knew these roads well, the headlights never slowed for the curves. She looked around the hidden room once more, memorizing its layout. If she survived this night, she'd need to bring the police back here. But first, she needed to ensure there would be a back here to return to. Using her phone's camera, she quickly photographed as many files as she could, the flash illuminating the room in stark bursts of white light. Each photo might be crucial evidence, each image potentially the key to solving not just Tommy's disappearance, but possibly dozens of other cases. The headlights were closer now, perhaps 5 minutes away. Sarah could make out the distinctive sound of a truck engine, diesel, powerful, built for these mountain roads. She pocketed her phone and took one last look around the room that had become both her greatest discovery and potentially her tomb. The hidden door swung shut behind her with a soft click, leaving the main cabin looking innocuous once again. Sarah grabbed her purse and car keys, her mind calculating distances and timing. She had maybe 3 minutes before the truck reached the cabin, but as she reached for the front door handle, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Fresh mud on the floor near the entrance, mud that hadn't been there when she'd arrived. Someone else had been in this cabin recently, very recently. The sound of the diesel engine was growing louder, and Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that her childhood nightmare was about to begin all over again. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at her 7-year-old face smiling back at her. The same school picture that had been plastered across newspapers 20 years ago, when her parents had vanished without a trace, when her world had collapsed overnight, leaving her alone with questions that ate away at her soul like acid. She forced herself to breathe, to think. The killer had kept trophies. Her parents' case had never been solved, filed away as another cold case in the overstuffed cabinets of the police department. But here was proof that someone had taken them, someone who had been watching her family closely enough to obtain her school photo. Sarah's eyes swept across the other files scattered on the makeshift desk. Names she didn't recognize, but faces that looked hauntingly familiar from old news reports. The Hendersons, who had disappeared during a camping trip 5 years ago. Maria Santos, the single mother, who had vanished from a rest stop. At least a dozen others, maybe more. A floorboard creaked somewhere above her head. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She hadn't imagined it. Someone was in the cabin. Moving as quietly as possible, she gathered several files, including her own photo, and stuffed them into her jacket. Her hands shook as she tried to organize the remaining papers exactly as she'd found them. Evidence. She needed evidence, but she also needed to get out alive. Another creak, this one closer to what she assumed was the staircase. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. Whoever was upstairs wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. Sarah's mind raced through her options. The hidden room had only one entrance, and she'd have to cross the basement to reach the stairs. But going upstairs meant walking directly toward the footsteps. Her phone had no signal down here, and even if she could call for help, no one would arrive in time. She clicked off the desk lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The footsteps had reached the top of the basement stairs. A beam of light cut through the darkness above, sweeping back and forth across the basement floor. "I know someone's down there," a voice called out. Male, gravelly, with an accent she couldn't quite place. "Saw your car on the road." Not very smart, leaving it where anyone could see. Sarah pressed herself against the far wall of the hidden room, barely breathing. The beam of light grew stronger as the footsteps descended the wooden stairs, each step deliberate and confident. This person knew the basement well, knew exactly where to step to avoid the creaking boards she'd stumbled over earlier. 20 years I've been using this place," the voice continued, conversational now, almost friendly. "Never had a visitor before. Most people are smart enough to stay away from old Matthias property. Stories about it being cursed, you know. I always found that amusing." The light swept across the basement, pausing at the bookshelf that concealed the hidden room. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the shadows. Through the crack between the shelf and the wall, she could see a tall figure silhouetted against the flashlight beam. He wore work clothes and heavy boots, and moved with the confidence of someone completely in control. "Course, the curse stories aren't entirely wrong," he continued with a low chuckle, "just not in the way people think. See, bad things do happen to folks who come sniffing around here. Very bad things." He was testing the bookshelf now, running his hands along the edges. Sarah realized with growing horror that he knew about the hidden room. Of course he did. He'd probably built it himself. Her fingers found the small window near the ceiling of the hidden room, the one she'd noticed earlier. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, and she had no idea where it led. But as the bookshelf began to shift, she realized it was her only option. The window latch was old and rusted, but it gave way under pressure. Cold night air rushed in, along with the smell of pine trees and damp earth. She could hear the bookshelf sliding open behind her as she pulled herself up toward the window. "Well, what do we have here?" The voice was much closer now, tinged with amusement and something darker. "My little collection room. Haven't been down here in months. Probably should have cleaned it up, but I do so enjoy my souvenirs." Sarah squeezed through the window, the rough wood scraping against her ribs. She found herself in a window well partially hidden by overgrown bushes. Above her, she could see the main level of the cabin, warm light spilling from the windows. Behind her, she heard papers rustling and a sharp intake of breath. "Now that's interesting," the voice said, no longer conversational. "Someone's been reading my files, and they took something." The tone had changed completely, cold fury replacing the mock friendliness. Sarah crawled out of the window well and ran toward the forest, the stolen files pressed against her chest like a shield against the darkness pursuing her. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as memories crashed over her like a dam bursting. She was 7 again, wearing that ridiculous polka dot dress her mother had bought for picture day at school, the same dress she'd been wearing the last time anyone saw her sister Emma alive. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The air in the hidden room felt thick and suffocating, heavy with the weight of 20 years of secrets. She forced herself to look at the other files scattered across the makeshift desk, each manila folder containing someone's worst nightmare. The names on the tabs blurred together: Jennifer Martinez, age 12, David Chen, age 8, Rebecca Williams, age 9. Children. They were all children. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank into the wooden chair behind the desk. The same chair where a monster had sat, organizing his collection of stolen lives like a twisted filing system. Her hands shook as she opened the folder with her own photo inside. The file was thicker than she'd expected. Page after page of handwritten notes in cramped, meticulous script. Surveillance logs detailing her family's daily routines. Maps of their neighborhood with escape routes marked in red ink. Photographs taken through windows, Emma brushing her teeth, their mother making breakfast, their father reading his newspaper. "October 15th, she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Target isolated. Parents at work conference until Sunday. Timing optimal. October 15th, the day Emma disappeared. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the cabin above." Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She strained to listen, but heard only the whistling wind through the trees and the settling of old wood. Just the cabin adjusting to the temperature change, she told herself. Nothing more. But then she heard it again, a deliberate footstep, followed by another. Someone was in the cabin. Panic flooded her system as she realized her mistake. She'd been so focused on the hidden room that she'd forgotten to lock the front door behind her. Worse, her car was parked outside like a beacon announcing her presence. The footsteps moved slowly, methodically, as if the person knew exactly where they were going. Sarah heard the refrigerator door open, then close. Cabinet doors opening and shutting in sequence. Someone was checking the cabin room by room, looking for her. Sarah's mind raced through her options. The hidden room had only one exit, the same entrance she'd used to get in. If she tried to leave now, she'd walk straight into whoever was upstairs. But if she stayed hidden, she'd be trapped if they discovered the room. The photograph of herself as a child stared up at her from the desk, innocent eyes wide with the trust of someone who still believed the world was safe. That little girl deserved justice. Emma deserved justice. All these children deserved someone to finally expose the truth. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah pulled out her phone and activated the camera. No signal meant no immediate help, but she could document everything. If something happened to her, at least there would be evidence. She photographed the files, the maps, the surveillance notes. Each image captured another piece of the puzzle that had haunted her family for 2 decades. The footsteps had moved to what sounded like the bedroom, drawers sliding open, objects being moved. The searcher was being thorough but careful, like someone accustomed to leaving no trace behind. Sarah's blood turned to ice. What if this wasn't a coincidence? What if her anonymous tip about the cabin hadn't been as untraceable as she'd thought? The killer could have been monitoring law enforcement communications, waiting to see if his hiding place had been compromised. She photographed the last of the files and slipped her phone back into her pocket. The footsteps had stopped, and the sudden silence was somehow worse than the searching sounds. Had the person left, or were they standing still, listening for her just as she was listening for them? A new sound made her blood freeze, the distinctive whine of old hinges that needed oil. The bookshelf door was opening. Light from the main cabin spilled down the stairs, followed by the slow, measured tread of someone descending into her hiding place. Sarah pressed herself against the far wall behind a filing cabinet and held her breath. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. "Hello, Sarah," said a familiar voice, calm and pleasant, as if greeting an old friend. "I've been waiting 20 years to meet you properly." The voice belonged to someone she knew, someone she trusted, someone who had been watching her much longer than she'd ever imagined. The metal stairs descended into absolute darkness, each step groaning under Sarah's weight like the cabin itself was warning her to turn back. She kept one hand pressed against the rough wooden wall, the other clutching her phone's flashlight beam that seemed pathetically small against the consuming black ahead. The air grew colder with each step, carrying scents that made her stomach clench, dampness, decay, and something else she couldn't identify but instinctively feared. When her foot finally touched solid ground, she estimated she'd descended at least 12 feet below the cabin's main floor. The phone's light revealed a narrow corridor stretching ahead, lined with what appeared to be reinforced wooden doors, 3 on each side, all closed, all fitted with heavy sliding bolts on the outside. Sarah's breathing became shallow as the implications settled over her like ice water. She approached the first door on her left, noting the small rectangular slot cut at eye level, a viewing window. Her hand trembled as she slid back the metal cover, revealing only darkness beyond. The space was empty, but the walls bore scratches, long, desperate gouges in the wood that could only have been made by fingernails. The second cell contained a single metal cot with restraints still attached to the frame, leather straps worn smooth from use. Sarah's phone light caught something glinting in the corner, a small silver chain. Even from the doorway she recognized it as a child's bracelet. Her legs nearly gave out. The third door hung slightly ajar, the bolt mechanism broken. Inside, the walls were covered in what looked like calendars, dozens of them, overlapping and layered, with dates marked in fading ink. Days crossed out in methodical X's, as if someone had been counting time, counting days of captivity, counting hope slipping away. Sarah forced herself to check each remaining cell, documenting the horror with photographs even as her mind recoiled from what she was seeing. Toys in one room, a teddy bear with one eye missing, building blocks scattered across the floor. Another contained women's clothing, sizes ranging from small to large, all neatly folded as if their owner might return for them. The final cell was different, larger than the others, with a desk pushed against one wall. This was where he worked, where he planned. The desktop held neat stacks of papers, photographs, and what appeared to be journals bound in black leather. Sarah's phone battery warning chimed. 15% remaining. She had to work fast. She grabbed the first journal and flipped it open. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant, detailing dates, locations, and descriptions in clinical detail. Her eyes caught fragments. Subject showed remarkable resilience. Parents searched for 3 weeks before giving up, disposed of evidence in usual location. The photographs made her drop the journal entirely. Dozens of 8x10 prints scattered across the dirt floor, surveillance photos of families, children playing in yards, people going about their daily lives, unaware they were being watched, studied, selected, and there, among the scattered images, was a photo that stopped her heart. Her own family, Mom, Dad, and 8-year-old Sarah building a snowman in their front yard. She remembered that day. It had snowed unexpectedly in November, and they'd rushed outside to build the snowman before it melted. Her father had made them all hot chocolate afterward. 3 weeks later, her parents were dead. The photo was dated 2 months before the murders. He'd been watching them, planning, waiting for the right moment. Her parents hadn't been random victims. They'd been specifically chosen, stalked, studied like specimens. But why? What had made her family special enough to warrant such attention? Sarah gathered up the scattered photos, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold them. Among the surveillance shots were others. Crime scene photos that must have been stolen from police files, newspaper clippings about the murders, and what appeared to be blueprints of her childhood home. Her phone chimed again. 10% battery. She stuffed the photos and journal into her jacket, then grabbed 2 more journals from the desk. Whatever answers existed, they were here in this underground chamber of horrors. She had to get them out, get them to the police, finally prove what had really happened to her family. As she turned to leave, her phone light swept across something mounted on the wall behind the desk, a map of the surrounding area marked with dozens of red pins. Each pin had a number written beside it in the same precise handwriting: burial sites. The scope of it overwhelmed her. This wasn't just about her family, this was decades of killing, dozens of victims, maybe hundreds, and she was standing in the center of it all, in the killer's private museum of death. Her phone died, plunging her into absolute darkness. Sarah bit back a scream and fumbled for the spare flashlight she'd seen upstairs. But first, she had to get out of this tomb, back to the surface, back to breathable air and the possibility of escape. She felt her way along the corridor wall, toward where the stairs should be, clutching the stolen evidence against her chest like a lifeline. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the photograph of herself as a 7-year-old, her gap-toothed smile frozen in time. The edges were worn smooth, as if someone had handled it countless times over the years. Behind her childhood image, dozens of other faces stared back from the corkboard, missing persons flyers, newspaper clippings, and more personal photographs that had no business being in this hidden room. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth as she recognized some of the faces. Jennifer Walsh, the college student who'd vanished 3 towns over last spring. Marcus Chen, the hiker who'd disappeared on the Appalachian Trail 6 months ago. Their cases had made the news, but seeing them here, pinned like butterflies in a collection, made her stomach lurch. She forced herself to study the board more carefully, looking for patterns. Red string connected various photos and newspaper articles, creating a web that spoke of meticulous planning. Dates were scrawled in the margins, some spanning back 15 years. This wasn't the work of an impulsive killer. This was someone who hunted with patience and precision. A manila folder labeled Morrison Family sat on the desk below the board, Sarah's maiden name. Her breath caught as she opened it, revealing police reports she'd never seen, crime scene photos that made bile rise in her throat, and medical examiner findings that reduced her parents and brother to clinical observations about wound patterns and time of death. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins that made her legs weak. Someone had been tracking her family for months before the murders. Her father's work schedule, her mother's grocery shopping routine, her brother's baseball practice times. Even her own school pickup schedule was documented in neat, careful handwriting. The sound of gravel crunching outside made her freeze. A car engine, getting closer. Sarah's training kicked in, the self-defense classes, the situational awareness seminars she'd attended after years of therapy. She quickly photographed as many documents as possible with her phone, her hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The manila folder went back exactly where she'd found it. The engine sound grew louder, then stopped. A car door slammed. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah crept to the small window in the hidden room. Through the grimy glass, she could see a dark pickup truck parked beside her rental car. A tall figure in a brown jacket was walking toward the cabin's front door, keys jingling in his hand. She had maybe 30 seconds before he entered the cabin. The hidden door was still open behind her, and she needed to close it without making noise. But first, she grabbed one more item from the desk, a small notebook filled with what looked like future plans, names and addresses she didn't recognize, but the methodical way they were organized made her skin crawl. The front door of the cabin creaked open just as she managed to pull the hidden door shut from the inside. Through the thin walls, she could hear heavy footsteps moving around the main room. The refrigerator door opened and closed. Water ran in the sink. Normal sounds that were anything but normal given what she'd just discovered. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. The notebook was still clutched in her hand, and she could feel the weight of all those photos on her phone, evidence that could finally bring justice for her family and potentially save the lives of future victims. The footsteps moved closer to the bedroom. She heard drawers opening, the closet door sliding on its track. He was looking for something, or checking to see if anything had been disturbed. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and the sound seemed deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. The footsteps in the bedroom stopped abruptly. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as silence stretched between them. She could picture him standing perfectly still, listening, trying to determine if he'd really heard something or if it was just the cabin settling. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps resumed, but now they were purposeful, systematic. He was searching room by room. It would only be a matter of time before he found the hidden door, especially if he knew about this room already. She looked around desperately for another way out. The small window was her only option, but it would mean leaving behind potential evidence and alerting him to the fact that someone had been here. Worse, she'd be climbing out directly into his line of sight if he happened to look outside. The footsteps were in the hallway now, getting closer to the bedroom wall that concealed her hiding place. Sarah clutched the notebook tighter and made her decision. 20 years of wondering, of nightmares, of feeling helpless. It all came down to the next few minutes. She wasn't running away this time. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she studied the face of the man standing behind her 8-year-old self. Marcus Webb, the same man who had been living in this cabin, who had served her coffee just hours ago with those same weathered hands that had destroyed her family. Her breathing came in short, ragged bursts as the full weight of the revelation crashed over her. The kind stranger who had offered her shelter during the storm wasn't a savior. He was the monster she'd been hunting for 2 decades. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the cabin above. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She'd been so absorbed in the files that she'd lost track of time. How long had she been down here? The storm outside had been her cover, but now she strained to listen for any sound that might indicate Marcus had returned. Another creak, deliberate this time. Footsteps. Sarah's hands flew over the scattered files, trying to organize them back into their original positions. Her movements were frantic but precise. Any evidence of her discovery could mean death. As she worked, her eyes caught glimpses of other victims' faces, their stories laid bare in clinical detail. Maps marked with burial sites, newspaper clippings tracking police investigations. This wasn't just a collection. It was a trophy room of human suffering. The footsteps moved across the cabin floor directly overhead, heading toward the kitchen where she had first sat with Marcus, drinking coffee and accepting his hospitality. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. Sarah grabbed her childhood photo and stuffed it into her jacket pocket. The rest would have to stay, but this one piece of evidence, this proof that Marcus Webb was connected to her family's disappearance, wasn't leaving without her. She clicked off the flashlight and moved toward the hidden door, feeling her way in the darkness. Her fingers found the edge of the panel, and she eased it open just enough to peer into the basement beyond. The main basement was dark, but a thin line of light now glowed at the bottom of the stairs leading up to the cabin. He was home, and he was awake. Sarah slipped through the opening and pushed the panel closed behind her, making sure it sealed properly. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would give her away. She had to get back to the guest room without being detected, had to pretend she had been sleeping peacefully while Marcus returned from wherever he'd been. She crept across the basement floor, avoiding the areas where she remembered the floorboards above had creaked earlier. Each step was calculated, deliberate. 20 years of military training and investigative work had prepared her for situations like this, but the personal stakes made everything feel different. This wasn't just another case. This was the moment that would define whether her life's work had meaning. She climbed the stairs one at a time, testing each step before putting her full weight down. The old wood protested softly, but the sounds were muffled by Marcus's activities in the kitchen area. When she reached the guest room door, Sarah turned the handle with agonizing slowness. The hinges cooperated silently, and she slipped inside, closing the door behind her with the same careful precision. Only then did she allow herself to breathe properly. Sarah moved to the bed and arranged the covers to look as though she had been sleeping. Her clothes were dusty from the hidden room, so she quickly changed into the spare shirt she'd packed, stuffing the contaminated clothes into her bag. The photograph crinkled softly in her jacket pocket as she handled the garment. She settled onto the bed and forced her breathing to slow, her body to relax. If Marcus checked on her, she needed to appear naturally sleepy, not terrified and hypervigilant. Minutes passed. The sounds from the kitchen gradually faded, replaced by the creaking of floorboards as Marcus moved through the cabin. Sarah tracked his progress by sound, from the kitchen to what must be a living area, then down a hallway toward what she assumed was his bedroom. A door closed somewhere in the cabin's depths. Sarah waited another 20 minutes before allowing herself to move. When she was confident Marcus had settled for the night, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the photograph. Even in the dim light filtering through the guest room window, she could make out the faces, her own young features filled with innocent joy, and behind her, the man who had destroyed everything. The evidence was in her hands now. After 20 years of searching, of following dead-end leads and building theories on circumstantial evidence, she finally had proof. The question that remained was whether she would live long enough to use it. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as memories crashed over her like a violent tide. She was 7 years old again, standing in their old kitchen while her mother braided her hair for picture day. The same blue dress, the same tentative smile, the same gap between her front teeth that had embarrassed her so much back then. But this wasn't her school photo. This was taken from outside their house, through the kitchen window. Someone had been watching her family long before that terrible night when everything changed. Sarah's breath came in short gasps as she forced herself to examine the other files scattered across the dusty table. Each manila folder contained a life interrupted. Rebecca Chen, age 23, last seen leaving her apartment in Portland. Marcus Williams, 19, vanished from a hiking trail in the Cascades. Amy Rodriguez, 34, disappeared from a gas station in Spokane. Dozens of them spanning decades. Her family's file was the thickest. With shaking fingers, she opened it to reveal surveillance photos she'd never seen before. Her father washing his car in the driveway, her mother hanging laundry in the backyard, her younger brother Tommy riding his bicycle in circles on their front sidewalk. The killer had documented their lives with the patience of a scientist studying specimens. A loose sheet of paper slipped from the folder and fluttered to the floor. Sarah bent to retrieve it, her blood turning to ice as she read the handwritten notes. David leaves for work 6:45 a.m., Margaret grocery shops Tuesdays 10 a.m. Children walk to school alone. The observations continued in the same careful script, detailing their routines, their vulnerabilities, their habits. Planning. He'd been planning their murders for months. Sarah's mind raced. The hidden room had no other exit. She was trapped 20 feet underground with nowhere to run. Heavy footsteps crossed the porch above, followed by the creak of the front door opening. "Sarah?" a man's voice called out, friendly and concerned. "Sarah, are you in here? Your car's outside?" She didn't recognize the voice, but that meant nothing. It had been 20 years. The monster who destroyed her family would be older now, his voice deeper, rougher. She pressed herself against the far wall of the hidden room, clutching the folder to her chest. The footsteps moved through the cabin above, floorboards groaning under the weight. Kitchen cabinets opened and closed. A chair scraped across the floor. He was searching methodically, and it was only a matter of time before he found the entrance to this room. Sarah's eyes darted around her underground prison, looking for anything she could use as a weapon. The metal shelving units were bolted to the walls. A few old tools hung from hooks near the ladder, but reaching them would require crossing directly under the entrance. "I know you're here somewhere," the voice called, closer now. He was in the bedroom directly above her. "We should talk, Sarah. After all these years, don't you think it's time?" The casual tone made her skin crawl. He spoke like they were old friends catching up, not predator and prey meeting for the final time. Sarah bit her lip to keep from making any sound, tasting blood. A new noise made her look up, the scraping of furniture being moved. He'd found the dresser that concealed the trapdoor. Light suddenly spilled down into the room as the entrance opened above her head. "There you are." Sarah looked up to see a silhouette blocking most of the light, but she could make out enough to know this wasn't the man from her nightmares. This person was too young, too thin, wrong height, wrong build entirely. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone who's been looking for this place almost as long as you have." The figure began climbing down the ladder. "My name is Detective Ryan Walsh. Your brother Tommy hired me to find you." Sarah's world tilted. "Tommy's alive?" "Very much so, and very worried about his sister who disappeared yesterday without telling anyone where she was going." Walsh reached the bottom of the ladder and turned to face her fully. He was maybe 40, with prematurely grey hair and kind eyes that reminded her painfully of her father. "He thought you might do something like this when you found out about the cabin. How did Tommy know about this place?" Walsh glanced around the room, his expression grim as he took in the files and photographs. "Because he's been hunting the same man you have, Sarah. For 20 years he's been hunting the man who killed your parents, and 3 days ago we finally found him." The folder slipped from Sarah's numb fingers, scattering crime scene photos across the concrete floor. "Where?" she whispered. "That's what we need to talk about." The floorboards groaned under Sarah's weight as she backed away from the desk, her mind reeling from the discovery of her own photograph among the victims. The little girl in the faded Polaroid smiled back at her with innocent eyes that had no idea what horrors awaited her family. Her hands trembled as she set the photo down, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the wall of faces surrounding her. Each photograph told a story of interrupted lives. Missing person flyers with desperate pleas from families, school photos of children who never made it home. The methodical organization of it all made her stomach churn. This wasn't the chaotic collection of a madman, but the careful archive of a predator who took pride in his work. A sound from outside froze her blood. The distant rumble of an engine approaching through the forest. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she rushed to the small window and peered through the grimy glass. Through the trees, she could make out headlights cutting through the gathering dusk, still far enough away to give her precious minutes. He was coming back. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to grab her keys and flee before he discovered her here, but her feet remained planted as she stared at the evidence surrounding her. This room contained the answers to questions that had tormented her for 20 years, the proof that could finally bring justice for her parents, for Emma, for all these victims whose faces watched her from the walls. Sarah forced herself to think clearly despite the panic clawing at her throat. She pulled out her phone, cursing silently at the single bar of reception. Her fingers flew across the screen as she began photographing everything. The wall of victims, the detailed files, the maps with marked locations. Each flash of the camera felt like a gunshot in the silent room. The engine grew louder. She could hear gravel crunching under tires as the vehicle navigated the rough forest road. Her phone's battery indicator showed 15%. Not enough time to document everything, but maybe enough to capture the most crucial evidence. A thick manila folder caught her attention, different from the others. Her family name was written across the tab in the same neat handwriting. Inside, she found police reports she'd never seen, newspaper clippings, and detailed surveillance photos of her family's daily routines. Photos of herself walking to school, her mother gardening, Emma playing in their backyard, all taken in the weeks before the attack. The methodical stalking revealed in those images made her sick, but it also filled her with a cold fury that burned away her fear. This monster had stolen her family's sense of safety long before he'd taken their lives. He'd watched them, studied them, planned their destruction while they lived their normal lives completely unaware. The headlights were visible through the trees now, maybe 2 minutes away. Sarah snapped photos of the surveillance pictures, her jaw clenched with determination. At the bottom of the folder, she found something that made her breath catch, a handwritten journal entry dated just 3 days ago. The girl has returned, just as I hoped she would. 20 years of patience rewarded. She doesn't know yet, but she will soon understand that some stories demand proper endings. The sound of a car door slamming echoed through the forest. Sarah's phone showed 8% battery as she frantically photographed the journal entry and the last few crucial documents. She could hear footsteps on the cabin's front porch now, heavy boots that brought back visceral memories of that terrible night. With no time left, Sarah closed the folder and looked around desperately for another exit. The window was too small and too high, and the door she'd entered through would lead her straight into his path. She was trapped in this room with its gallery of victims, and in moments he would discover her here. But as terror threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah felt something else rising within her, a fierce resolve that surprised her with its strength. She wasn't the helpless 8-year-old who had hidden in a closet anymore. She was a woman who had survived, who had spent 2 decades preparing for this moment without even knowing it. The front door of the cabin creaked open. Sarah clutched her phone, praying the photos had uploaded to the cloud despite the weak signal. If she didn't make it out of here alive, at least the evidence would survive her. The truth would finally have a chance to emerge from the darkness where it had been buried for so long. Heavy footsteps moved through the cabin above her head, and Sarah pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding as she waited to face the monster who had destroyed her world. The floorboards groaned under Sarah's weight as she crept toward the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat, every creak of the old cabin a warning. She clutched the hammer tighter, its weight both reassuring and inadequate against what might be coming. The kitchen window offered a clear view of the driveway, and her blood turned to ice. Headlights cut through the darkness, growing larger as they approached. The vehicle moved slowly, deliberately, as if the driver was savoring the moment of return. Sarah's mind raced through her options. The front door was too exposed. The back door led into dense woods, but she'd be stumbling blind through unfamiliar terrain. The hidden room, no, that would trap her completely. She needed to think like the hunter, not the prey. The engine shut off, and silence descended like a shroud. Car door slamming. Footsteps on gravel, measured and confident. Sarah ducked below the windowsill, her breathing shallow and controlled, despite the panic clawing at her chest. She heard keys jingling, then the distinctive sound of a lock turning. The front door opened with a familiar squeal that she now realized had been a warning she'd ignored earlier. Heavy boots crossed the threshold, pausing just inside the doorway. "Well, well," a voice called out, rich with dark amusement. "Looks like I have a visitor." The voice was exactly as she remembered from her nightmares, smooth, cultured, with an underlying current of cruelty that made her skin crawl. Marcus Holloway, the man who had shattered her world and walked away clean. "No point hiding, Sarah. I can smell your fear from here." Her blood froze. He knew her name, knew she was here. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a coincidence. He'd been expecting her. 20 years, he continued, his footsteps moving through the living room with casual confidence. 20 years I've been waiting for you to find your way back to me. I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve. Sarah's mind reeled. Waiting for her? This was a trap, carefully laid and patiently maintained. But how? She forced herself to focus, to push past the terror and think clearly. The photo in the hidden room, it hadn't been a trophy, it had been bait. "Your family put up quite a fight, you know." Holloway's voice drifted closer. "Your father especially, brave man, stupid but brave. He actually thought he could protect you all." Rage flared hot and bright in Sarah's chest, cutting through the fear like a blade. She gripped the hammer tighter, her knuckles white. This monster had stolen everything from her, and now he was taunting her with the memory of her father's final moments. I've been watching you, Sarah, following your pathetic attempts to find me. Did you really think those private investigators would succeed where the police failed? I've been 3 steps ahead of you the entire time." The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen. Sarah could hear him breathing, slow and steady, like a predator savoring the hunt. She pressed herself against the cabinet, every muscle coiled and ready. "I left you alive for a reason that night," he said, his voice now dangerously soft. "I wanted you to grow up knowing what you'd lost. I wanted you to search for me, to become obsessed with finding me, and here you are, exactly as I planned." A shadow fell across the kitchen doorway. Sarah's grip on the hammer shifted, her body preparing for violence. She thought of her family, her mother's laugh, her sister's smile, her father's strong hands teaching her to ride a bike. They deserved justice. They deserved to be avenged. "But I have to admit," Holloway continued, "you've exceeded my expectations. Breaking into my sanctuary, finding my collection, I'm almost proud of you." The shadow moved, and suddenly he was there, filling the doorway like a nightmare made flesh. Older now, grey at the temples, but unmistakably the same man who had haunted her dreams. His eyes found hers immediately, and his lips curved into a smile that chilled her to the bone. "Hello, Sarah. You've grown up beautifully." Time seemed suspended in that moment, predator and prey facing each other across 20 years of pain and planning. Sarah felt the weight of every sleepless night, every unanswered question, every tear shed for her lost family, but alongside the fear and rage, something else bloomed in her chest, a cold, calculating determination. She wasn't the terrified child who had hidden in the closet anymore. She was a woman who had spent 2 decades preparing for this moment, even if she hadn't realized it, and Marcus Holloway, for all his careful planning, had made one crucial mistake. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached for the manila folder marked with her family's name. The photograph of her 8-year-old self stared back from the wall, innocent eyes unaware of the horror that would soon shatter her world. 20 years of nightmares, 20 years of unanswered questions, and now she stood in the very heart of the monster's lair. The folder was thick, heavier than she expected. Inside, police reports she'd never seen, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, and photographs that made her stomach lurch. Crime scene photos of her parents' bedroom, the kitchen where her mother had tried to run, the back door where the killer had entered. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins that made her blood run cold. Subject exhibited interesting defensive patterns. Mother's protection instinct stronger than anticipated. Father neutralized quickly, disappointing lack of fight. The clinical detachment in the words made her want to vomit. Her parents reduced to subjects in some twisted experiment. She flipped through more pages, finding detailed observations about her own behavior in the weeks following the murders. How had he been watching her? How close had he been all these years? A floorboard creaked somewhere in the cabin above her head. Sarah's breath caught. She'd been so absorbed in the files that she'd lost track of time, of her surroundings. The sound came again, deliberate footsteps moving across the main floor. He was back. Panic flooded her system, but she forced herself to think. The basement had only one exit. The stairs she'd descended. She was trapped unless she could find another way out. Her eyes swept the room frantically, searching for any other opening, but the concrete walls offered no escape. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. In the silence that followed, she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then came the scrape of the bookshelf being moved aside. Sarah grabbed the folder and pressed herself against the wall beside the hidden door, out of sight from anyone descending the stairs. The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the room in methodical arcs. She held her breath, clutching the evidence against her chest. "I know you're down here, Sarah." The voice was calm, almost conversational, exactly as she remembered from that night 20 years ago when she'd hidden in her bedroom closet, listening to him move through their house. The same voice that had haunted her dreams ever since. "You've grown into such a beautiful woman, just like your mother." His footsteps descended slowly, each step echoing in the confined space. "I've been watching you, you know, waiting for the right moment. When I saw you'd rented the cabin next door, well, it felt like fate." Sarah's mind raced. He was between her and the only exit. But he couldn't see her yet, not in the shadows where she'd positioned herself. She needed to think like the investigative journalist she'd become, not the terrified child she'd once been. Rebecca, the hiker who'd gone missing 3 weeks ago. The case Sarah had been investigating. He had her, or had disposed of her, and was documenting it just like all the others, just like he'd documented her family's murder. "I left your photograph where you'd find it," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I wanted you to understand. This has always been about you, Sarah. Everyone else was just practice." The beam of light found her. For a moment, they stared at each other across the small room. He was older than in her memories, grayer, but his eyes held the same cold intelligence that had terrified her as a child. He wore ordinary clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, looking like any other local resident. The banality of his appearance somehow made him more frightening. "There you are," he said softly. "My little survivor. Do you know how rare you are? How special? Most children don't have the presence of mind to hide so effectively. I've thought about you every day since that night." Sarah found her voice, surprised by how steady it sounded. "Where is Rebecca Chen?" He tilted his head, studying her with genuine curiosity. "Still thinking like a journalist, I see, even now. Fascinating." He took a step closer. "She's safe, for now. Just like you could be if you make the right choices." "What choices?" His smile widened, and Sarah saw nothing human in it. "The same choice I gave your parents. Fight and die quickly, or cooperate and see how long you can survive." The basement stairs creaked under Sarah's weight as she descended into the darkness, her phone's flashlight cutting through the oppressive gloom. The musty air filled her lungs, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic that made her stomach turn. Each step felt like a decision she couldn't take back, but the pull of answers was stronger than her fear. The concrete floor was uneven beneath her feet, and the flashlight beam revealed a workshop that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust-covered tools hung from pegboards, their shadows dancing as her hand trembled, but it was the far corner that drew her attention, a workbench with something covered by a tarp. Sarah approached slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached out with one shaking hand and pulled the tarp away. Photographs, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows across the surface, all children, all smiling, all missing, she realized with growing horror. Her flashlight moved across the faces, and she recognized some from old milk cartons and news reports that had haunted her childhood nightmares. In the center of the collection, larger than the rest, was a school photo she remembered posing for. 3rd grade, gap-toothed smile, pigtails tied with yellow ribbons. Her own face stared back at her from 20 years ago. But it wasn't alone. Next to it were photos of her walking to school, playing in her backyard, sleeping in her bed through her bedroom window. Dozens of them, documenting weeks, or maybe months of surveillance. Her stalker hadn't just taken her family. He had been planning to take her too. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank onto a wooden stool, her mind reeling. All these years, she'd assumed she survived because she wasn't home that night. The sleepover at Jenny Morrison's house that had saved her life, or so she'd thought. Now she understood the truth. He had been watching, waiting, planning. Her absence had disrupted his timeline. A sound from upstairs made her freeze. Footsteps on the cabin floor above, slow and deliberate. Then a voice, muffled but unmistakably calling her name. "Sarah? I know you're here, sweetheart. I saw your car." The endearment in that gravelly voice made her skin crawl. She clicked off the flashlight and crouched behind the workbench, her pulse thundering in her ears. The footsteps moved across the floor above, methodical, searching. "I've been waiting so long for you to come home," the voice continued, closer now to the basement stairs. 20 years is a long time to be patient, but good things come to those who wait." The footsteps started down the stairs. She pressed herself against the cold concrete wall behind the workbench, trying to make herself invisible in the darkness. Her phone was still clutched in her hand, and she realized the mistake too late. She'd left the photos exposed on the workbench when she pulled away the tarp. Now, the voice said, amused. Playing hide and seek? We used to play that game when you were little. Well, not together, but I watched you play it with your brother in the backyard. You were never very good at hiding. The beam of a powerful flashlight swept across the basement, far brighter than her phone's weak light. It moved methodically, searching every corner, every shadow. Sarah held her breath and pressed harder against the wall, but she knew it was only a matter of time. "I see you've found my collection," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I saved your picture all these years, right in the center, where it belongs. You were supposed to be the crown jewel, Sarah, the one that got away, but now you're here, and we can finally finish what we started." The light was getting closer. Sarah's hand tightened around her phone, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button even though she knew it was useless without signal. She had pepper spray in her purse upstairs, a small knife in her car's glove compartment. Nothing helpful down here except shadows that were rapidly disappearing. "I know you think I'm the monster," the voice continued, conversational now, as if they were discussing the weather. "But I gave those children something beautiful. I gave them forever. No growing old, no disappointment, no broken hearts. They'll always be perfect, always innocent. I was going to give you that gift, too." The flashlight beam touched the edge of her shoe. "Found you." Sarah looked up into a face she'd seen in nightmares for 2 decades, now illuminated by harsh LED light. Older, grayer, but unmistakably the same man whose sketch had hung on police station walls and whose description had been burned into her memory. He smiled down at her with grandfatherly warmth that made her blood run cold. "Hello, Sarah. Welcome home." The kitchen drawers slid open with rusty protests. Her fingers closed around the handle of a carving knife, its blade catching the dim light filtering through grimy windows. Not ideal, but it would have to do. She tested its weight, remembering the self-defense classes she'd taken after college, back when she still believed preparation could keep the monsters at bay. A sound from outside made her freeze, footsteps on gravel, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin like a predator testing the perimeter. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized her tactical error. She'd been so focused on finding evidence and weapons that she'd forgotten to watch for his return. The footsteps stopped at the front door. Sarah pressed herself against the kitchen wall, knife raised, as the doorknob turned with agonizing slowness. The hinges shrieked like dying birds as the door swung open. She could hear him breathing, a wet, labored sound that made her skin crawl. His footsteps moved into the living room, paused, then headed directly toward the hidden room. He knew. Somehow, he knew she'd been there. "Sarah Chen." His voice drifted through the cabin, conversational and terrifyingly calm. "Age 32, investigative journalist for the Portland Tribune. Drives a blue Honda Civic, license plate." She didn't wait to hear the rest. Moving as silently as possible, she slipped from the kitchen toward the back of the cabin, searching for another exit. The voice continued behind her, reciting details about her life with the mechanical precision of someone reading from a file. Lost her family in the Riverside Massacre, August 15th, 2003. Parents David and Linda Chen, younger brother Michael. The sole survivor, found hiding in... "Shut up!" The words tore from her throat before she could stop them. Her cover was blown anyway, might as well face this head-on. She spun around, knife extended, to find him standing in the doorway to the hidden room. He was smaller than she'd expected, almost disappointingly ordinary. Thinning grey hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of face that would disappear in a crowd. But his eyes held the flat, predatory gleam of something that had stopped being human long ago. "You came back," he said, smiling. "I wondered if you would. Most of them run. Most of them don't know what you are." "And what am I, Sarah?" He stepped closer, hands clasped behind his back like a professor addressing a student. "What have you decided I am? A monster who destroyed my family." "Liar!" Sarah lunged forward, the knife cutting through air as he sidestepped with practiced ease. She stumbled, regained her balance, spun to face him again. "I never lie about my work," he said, pulling a thick folder from behind his back. "Would you like to see the documentation? 20 years of research, Sarah. I've been following your family story long before that night in Riverside." The folder hit the floor, photographs spilling across the worn wood. Sarah caught glimpses of surveillance shots, her family at the grocery store, Michael at soccer practice, her parents arguing in their kitchen. The photos were dated months before the murders. "You stalked us." "I studied you. There's a difference." He circled her slowly, staying just out of knife range. The Chen family was falling apart from the inside. "I simply accelerated the process. A few well-placed suggestions, some carefully revealed secrets, and nature took its course." Sarah's hands shook as the implications hit her. "You made them fight that night. You made my father—" The knife felt slippery in her sweating palm. This wasn't how she'd imagined it would go. She'd pictured herself strong, righteous, delivering justice to a cowering monster. Instead, she felt like a child again, hiding in the closet while her world collapsed around her. "The question now," he continued, "is what you'll choose to do with the truth. You could run, report me to the authorities, try to rebuild the fantasy you've constructed about that night, or—" his smile widened, revealing teeth stained yellow with age and neglect. "You could stay and learn what really happened to your family." The basement door groaned shut behind Sarah as she climbed the wooden steps, each creak echoing through the silence like a countdown. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the weight of discovery pressing down on her shoulders. 20 years of questions had been answered in the span of minutes, and now she faced the hardest decision of her life. She paused at the top of the stairs, her hand trembling on the doorknob. Through the kitchen window she could see her car parked in the gravel driveway, keys still dangling from the ignition. 30 seconds, maybe less, and she could be racing down the mountain road toward civilization, toward safety, toward a life where she could finally stop looking over her shoulder. But Marcus Holloway's face stared back at her from the shadows of her memory. Not the weathered, silver-haired man from the grocery store, but the younger version she'd glimpsed in those newspaper clippings. The monster who had torn her family apart and walked free while she spent 2 decades in therapy trying to piece together fragments of a shattered childhood. Sarah moved through the cabin like a ghost, her fingers trailing along surfaces that suddenly felt contaminated. The comfortable reading chair by the fireplace, the hand-carved coffee table, the wool throw draped over the sofa, all of it belonged to him. All of it had been touched by hands that had committed unspeakable acts. She found herself standing before the mantelpiece, studying the collection of seemingly innocent objects displayed there. A smooth river stone, a dried wildflower pressed between glass, a small wooden carving of a bear. Trophies, she realized with a chill that ran deeper than the mountain air. Each item probably represented a victim, a life stolen and reduced to a keepsake. The sound of tires on gravel shattered her reverie. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she peered through the front window. A dark pickup truck was winding up the access road, still a quarter-mile away, but approaching steadily. Even from this distance, she could make out the familiar outline of the driver's silhouette. He was coming home. Panic flooded her system, but alongside it came something else, a cold, hard resolve that surprised her with its intensity. She thought of her sister Emily's bright laugh, forever silenced, of her parents' faces in those last family photos, radiant with love and hope for the future, of all the other faces she'd seen in those files downstairs, victims whose families still wondered what had happened to their loved ones. Sarah's gaze fell on the kitchen knife block. The largest blade gleamed in the afternoon light, filtering through the windows. She could take it, hide behind the door, and when Marcus Holloway walked into his sanctuary of horrors, she could end it. One thrust, and decades of pain would finally have meaning. But as her fingers closed around the knife's handle, doubt crept in. She wasn't a killer, despite what he had made her fantasize about during her darkest moments. And if she failed, if he overpowered her, she would become just another trophy on his mantelpiece. The truck's engine grew louder. Sarah released the knife and ran for the back door, her mind racing through possibilities. The forest behind the cabin was dense, offering cover but also the risk of getting lost in unfamiliar terrain. Her car keys dangled tantalizingly in the front window, but reaching them would mean exposing herself completely. She slipped out the back door and pressed herself against the cabin's log wall, her breathing shallow and controlled. Through the kitchen window, she watched as the truck pulled into the driveway and Marcus Holloway stepped out. He moved with the casual confidence of a man coming home after running errands, a paper grocery bag tucked under one arm. He looked so ordinary, so harmlessly normal. But Sarah had seen his basement. She had held the evidence of his true nature in her hands. As he approached the front door, Sarah made her choice. Instead of fleeing into the woods, she crept along the cabin's perimeter toward her car. The keys were her lifeline, but they also represented something more, the chance to return with help, with authorities who could finally see what she had seen. Marcus paused at his front door, keys jingling in his hand. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought he sensed something amiss. His head turned slightly, as if listening for sounds that didn't belong. Then he shrugged and stepped inside. Sarah sprinted across the open ground, gravel crunching under her feet. She yanked open the car door and threw herself behind the wheel, her hands shaking as she turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she slammed the vehicle into reverse. Through the cabin's front window, she saw Marcus's face appear, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something far more dangerous. Their eyes met across 20 years of silence and secrets. Sarah floored the accelerator and raced toward the mountain road. Marcus Holloway's image burned into her rearview mirror as he emerged from his lair, watching her escape with the patience of a predator who knew exactly where his prey was headed. The basement door creaked as Sarah descended into darkness, her phone's flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed to writhe and retreat from the beam. Each step down the wooden stairs felt like a descent into her own past, into the nightmare that had shaped every day of her life for 20 years. The basement was larger than she'd expected, stretching beyond the cabin's footprint. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and wrong that made her stomach clench. Her light swept across the space, revealing workbenches lined with tools that gleamed, despite the dust covering everything else. But it was the far wall that stopped her breath entirely. Photographs, hundreds of them, arranged in neat rows like a gallery of the damned. Sarah's hands shook as she approached, the flashlight beam dancing across face after face of people she didn't recognize. Young women, mostly, but also men, teenagers, even children, all smiling in what appeared to be candid shots, at parks, outside stores, walking down streets. Hunting photos, she realized with growing horror. Pictures taken before they became victims. In the center of this macabre collection hung a larger photo, and Sarah's knees nearly buckled when she saw it. Her family, the 4 of them at a carnival, cotton candy in her small hands, her parents laughing at something her brother had said. She remembered that day. It had been just 2 weeks before they died. "You found it." Sarah spun around, her heart exploding in her chest. Thomas stood at the bottom of the stairs, blocking her only exit. In the harsh light of her phone, his face looked different, the gentle, helpful expression she'd known replaced by something cold and calculating. "I was wondering when you'd work it up," he continued, stepping into the basement with the casual air of someone entering their own living room. "You're smarter than most. More determined, too. You killed them." The words came out as barely a whisper. "My family. You murdered them." Thomas tilted his head, studying her with the detached interest of an entomologist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Your father was getting close, too close. He'd connected 3 of the disappearances to this area, and he was methodical, thorough. It was only a matter of time before he found me. So you killed them all, even Emma, even my mother." Sarah's voice was growing stronger, fueled by a rage that had been building for 2 decades. They had nothing to do with his investigation. Collateral damage. Thomas shrugged. Though I will admit, your brother wasn't planned. He came home early from that friend's house. Bad timing. The casual way he dismissed her family's deaths, as if they were minor inconveniences rather than the destruction of everything she'd ever loved, sent white-hot fury coursing through Sarah's veins. And you've been doing it ever since. All these people. She gestured at the photographs behind her. It's what I am, Thomas said simply. What I've always been. Your father understood that, in the end. He knew he couldn't stop me. Only delay the inevitable. But you made a mistake, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. You kept me alive. Thomas's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. You were supposed to die in that cabin with the rest of them. The fire should have taken you too. But you hid, didn't you? Like a little mouse in the walls. And now I'm going to finish what my father started. Thomas laughed, the sound echoing off the basement walls. Are you? And how exactly do you plan to do that? You're trapped down here with me, Sarah. No one knows where you are. Your phone has no signal this deep underground. He pulled a knife from his jacket, the blade catching the light from her phone. You're going to join your family tonight. I should have made sure of that 20 years ago. He stumbled but didn't fall, turning toward her with a snarl that transformed his face into something inhuman. You little bitch. I'm going to make this slow. Sarah backed toward the wall of photographs, her mind racing. She needed to get past him, needed to reach the stairs, but he was between her and freedom. The basement felt like a tomb, and she was beginning to understand that only one of them would leave it alive. Good, she said, raising the hammer again. I was hoping you'd make this personal. Thomas smiled, cold and predatory. Oh, Sarah, this has always been personal. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled the gasoline can from the storage shed behind the cabin. The weight of it felt like destiny in her grip. 20 years of nightmares, 20 years of wondering why her little brother never came home from the park that day, 20 years of watching her parents slowly die from grief. It all led to this moment. The hidden room had revealed everything. Dozens of files, photographs, trophies, children's belongings arranged like museum pieces. And there, in the center of it all, her own school photo from 2nd grade, the one her mother had frantically distributed to every news station in the state. He'd been watching her family long before he took Michael. The gasoline sloshed against the cabin's wooden walls as she poured it in careful lines around the foundation. The fumes made her dizzy, or maybe that was the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She'd memorized every face in those files, every name. Tomorrow, she'd mail copies to the FBI field office in Denver. But tonight, this place burned. A twig snapped behind her. Sarah spun around, the empty gas can clattering to the ground. A figure emerged from the tree line, moving with the careful gait of someone trying not to startle a wild animal. In the moonlight, she could make out a thin man in his 60s, grey hair receding, wire-rimmed glasses catching the silver light. He looked like someone's grandfather. Someone who might volunteer at the library or coach Little League. Sarah, he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered from her nightmares. Soft, gentle, the voice that had asked 7-year-old her if she'd seen a lost puppy. The voice she'd been smart enough to run from that day, leaving Michael behind at the swings. You remember me. It wasn't a question. Thomas Kellerman stepped closer, hands visible and empty, as if he were approaching a frightened deer. I wondered if you would. Most children forget. I never forgot. The words came out as a growl. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the knife she'd taken from his kitchen. I remembered your voice, your face, the blue van. Ah yes, the van. I got rid of that years ago. He smiled, and it was the most horrible thing Sarah had ever seen. You were always the smart one. Too smart. If you'd just stayed on that playground a few more minutes, you would have taken us both. Perhaps. Or perhaps seeing you again would have changed my mind entirely. His eyes moved to the gasoline stains on the cabin wall, then back to her face. "You've been busy. Breaking and entering, destruction of property. Your brother wouldn't approve." The mention of Michael hit like a physical blow. "Don't you dare talk about him." Michael was special. They all were in their own ways, but Michael... Kellerman's expression grew distant, almost wistful. "He asked about you, you know, right until the end. Wondered if you were coming to find him." Sarah's vision blurred with rage and tears. The knife was in her hand now, though she didn't remember drawing it. "Where is he? Where did you bury him?" "You poisoned my life." She took a step forward, then another. The knife felt right in her grip, like an extension of her arm. "You destroyed my family. My parents never recovered. They died believing they'd failed to protect their children. And what will killing me accomplish? Will it bring Michael back? Will it heal your parents' broken hearts?" Kellerman didn't retreat as she approached. If anything, he seemed genuinely curious about her answer. "No," Sarah said quietly, "but it will stop you from taking anyone else. I'm 68 years old, my dear. Arthritis in my hands, my knees, my hunting days are long behind me." He gestured toward the cabin. "This place has become more museum than workshop, a place to remember what I once was." Bullshit. Sarah was close enough now to see the calculation in his eyes, the predator still lurking beneath the grandfatherly facade. "There's a fresh grave behind the shed." The dirt's barely settled. For the first time, his composure cracked. Just slightly, but enough for Sarah to see the truth underneath. "Who was it?" she demanded. "Who was the last one?" Kellerman's smile returned, cold and satisfied. "Someone else who came looking for answers they weren't prepared to find." Sarah lunged forward with the knife, but he was ready. Despite his claims of infirmity, his hand shot out like a striking snake, catching her wrist with surprising strength. The floorboards groaned under Sarah's feet as she backed toward the cabin's front door, her eyes never leaving Marcus Wells. The man who had haunted her nightmares for 20 years stood motionless in the doorway of his trophy room, watching her with the same cold calculation she remembered from that terrible night. "You were always the smart one," he said, his voice carrying that same gentle tone that had once fooled her parents into trusting him. "Even as a child, you saw through people's masks." Sarah's hand found the door handle behind her, but it wouldn't turn. Locked. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she'd walked directly into his trap. The broken window, the unlocked door, the perfectly placed photograph, all of it designed to lure her inside. "The families never suspected their friendly neighbor," Marcus continued, taking a step closer. "The man who helped search for their missing children, the one who brought casseroles and offered comfort." His lips curved into a smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. "But you always watched me with those serious little eyes, didn't you? You killed them." The words came out stronger than Sarah felt. "My parents, my sister, all those families. I gave them peace," Marcus said, his tone eerily serene. "Released them from the burden of living in a world full of predators and pain. Your sister understood in the end." She stopped crying. Rage flared in Sarah's chest, burning away the fear. She'd spent 2 decades preparing for this moment, planning what she would do if she ever found him. Her hand slipped to the knife, concealed in her jacket pocket. "The police know where I am," she lied. "They'll be here soon." Marcus laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "No, they won't. You came here alone, just like I knew you would. You couldn't resist the chance to face me, could you? To prove you're not that terrified little girl hiding in the closet anymore." He was right, and they both knew it. Sarah had told no one about the cabin, about her suspicions. She'd wanted this confrontation to be hers alone. 20 years I've been waiting," Marcus said, moving closer. "Knowing someday you'd remember. Someday you'd come looking. You're the only one who got away, Sarah. The only loose thread in my perfect tapestry." Sarah's fingers closed around the knife handle. "Good. I want you to know it's me who stops you." She lunged forward, but Marcus was ready. His hand shot out, catching her wrist in a grip that sent fire shooting up her arm. The knife clattered to the floor, as he twisted her arm behind her back. "Still fighting," he murmured in her ear. "Just like your mother." The words ignited something primal in Sarah. She drove her elbow back into his ribs, feeling bone crack under the impact. Marcus grunted and loosened his grip just enough for her to break free. She dove for the knife, but he grabbed her ankle, sending her crashing into the wall. Stars exploded across her vision as her head struck the wooden beam. Through the haze, she saw Marcus reaching for something on the mantelpiece, a length of rope, worn smooth from use, the same rope he'd used on all the others. Sarah's hand found a heavy brass candlestick that had fallen from a shelf. As Marcus turned back toward her, she swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The metal connected with his temple with a sickening crack. Marcus staggered, blood streaming down his face, but he didn't fall. Instead, he smiled, revealing teeth stained red. "You can't kill me, Sarah. You're not like me. You're too good, too pure. That's why you'll always lose." "You're right," Sarah said, struggling to her feet. "I'm not like you." She grabbed the fallen knife and drove it deep into his chest, just below the ribs. Marcus's eyes went wide with shock and something that might have been pride. "But I'm not too good to stop a monster," she finished. Marcus collapsed, his hands clutching at the wound. Dark blood pooled beneath him, seeping into the floorboards that had absorbed so many secrets. His breathing grew shallow, then stopped altogether. Sarah stood over his body, trembling. 20 years of nightmares, of looking over her shoulder, of wondering if she'd imagined the evil she'd witnessed. All of it ended here, in this room full of stolen lives. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice steady as she reported the location. Then she walked back into the hidden room and began carefully removing the photographs and files, evidence that would finally give closure to dozens of families who had never stopped hoping. As sirens wailed in the distance, Sarah placed her own childhood photograph on top of the pile. The scared little girl in the picture seemed to smile back at her, finally at peace. It was over.